The cot was cold beneath her, its steel frame groaning with the faintest movement, and Anya Woodberg lay curled upon it, her body caught in the tension of sleeplessness. The thin blanket clung to her knees like a feeble disguise against the chill, but the cold was not what kept her awake. It was the replay, the unending reel of flashing lights and raised voices, the weight of hands gripping her arms, and the metallic bite of the cuffs as they locked around her wrists. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw herself from the outside, her reflection caught in the glass of the patrol car window, her face unrecognizable, emptied of all certainty. Somewhere in the background, blurred and shrinking, was her bookstore, the small world she had built and filled with quiet order, now left behind in a scatter of pages and confusion. And then there was Kai. The thought came like a knife. Tears pressed against her lashes, but she blinked them back, refusing to surrender to that weakness. Where was she now? Did Fred find her in time? Was she frightened, calling for me? The image of Kai alone, her little hand searching for someone to hold, burrowed deep into Anya's chest until she could barely breathe. The ache became something physical, twisting inside her ribs, and she bit the inside of her cheek to keep the sound from escaping. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not here, not in this place that smelled of bleach and steel and the faded traces of other people's despair. The night pressed in, long and airless, punctuated only by the faint rhythm of footsteps beyond the door and the occasional murmur of distant voices. Time lost its edges. Anya sat up, then lay back down, then sat up again, hugging her knees to her chest. Memory became a fever. Her father's hard profile, her mother's careful silence, Elizabeth's eyes, sharp and pale. The lake, the water catching the light of a gray morning. James. They all circled her mind like vultures. When dawn finally crept through the small barred window, the diluted gray made everything inside the cell look even more colorless. Her body was stiff, her eyes raw from sleeplessness. The untouched meal from the night before still sat on the metal table, congealed and sad. She had tried to ignore it, but even the smell had turned her stomach. Hunger belonged to those who still had space for peace, and there was none left in her. The sound of a key in the lock startled her. It was sharp and intimate in the silence, a reminder of how little freedom even her thoughts had here. The door opened with a low, reluctant groan, and Ian Lewis appeared in the frame, his presence cutting through the air like a gust of cold air. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable, but it was his eyes that unsettled her, dark, searching, carrying a weight she could not decipher. He stepped inside, his gaze falling on the untouched tray before drifting back to her. "You didn't eat," he said quietly, his voice even, almost weary. Anya looked at him, her expression hollow and unflinching. Words felt pointless. Did he really think she could eat after being dragged from her life and locked away from her daughter? Did he imagine that food could fill what had been emptied out of her? "You'll make yourself sick if you keep this up," he said after a moment, softer this time, as though the words had slipped out before he could pull them back. A sound rose from her chest, brittle and small, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "I'm already sick," she said, her voice rough, stripped of its usual grace. "Sick of being here, sick of the lies, sick of—" She faltered, the rest dissolving in her throat. "Sick of everything." Her hands clenched in her lap, knuckles white against the dull fabric of her cell uniform. He stood there, silent, his jaw tightened, a muscle twitching near the corner of his mouth. For a moment, something human flickered in his face. Hesitation, maybe guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the rigid stillness of duty. "I came to check on you," he said finally. "Out of guilt." Her voice was low now, almost tender in its bitterness. "Or to make sure your suspect hasn't gone mad yet." Ian didn't move, nor did he answer. The tension between them grew heavier. At last, he shifted his weight, his tone measured again. "Fred is working on your case. You know that. But you need to eat, Anya. You need to take care of yourself." She lifted her gaze to meet his, and for a moment, her exhaustion burned away, leaving only raw, bright fury and grief. "The only thing I need," she whispered, "is to go home to my daughter." He held her eyes longer than he should have. There was something in his expression, something that might have been doubt or regret, or the faintest fracture in his resolve. But before she could name it, he turned and walked out. The door shut behind him, with a single, echoing clang that seemed to seal the world away once more. Anya stayed where she was, her body tense, her mind circling through all the questions that never found answers. She didn't trust him, she couldn't. Yet, she had seen something shift in Ian Lewis's eyes, a shadow of uncertainty that did not belong to a man convinced of her guilt. It was a small thing, fleeting and fragile, but it was enough to stir the faintest whisper of something she had not dared to feel: hope. Fred's footsteps cut through the marble corridors of the Metropolitan Police headquarters, like a pulse too loud for the body to contain. The echo followed him down the sterile hall, each step fueled by the kind of fury that burned cold, precise, the kind that came from helplessness. The air inside the building was sharp with disinfectant, coffee, and the faint static of conversation. But to him, it all blurred into a hum, a low and meaningless drone. He could feel eyes following him, the subtle shifts of posture as colleagues moved aside, their unease a ripple that preceded him. They knew the look in his eyes. They knew the kind of a man who walked like that. He didn't stop to acknowledge anyone. He didn't nod, didn't return their murmured greetings. His thoughts had narrowed to a single, white-hot thread. Anya, locked behind bars, her wrists marked from the cuffs, her voice breaking against the indifference of those who called themselves protectors of justice. And Kai, who had fallen asleep in his arms the night before, her small hand resting over his heart, unaware that the woman she called mother was sleeping on a steel cot miles away. The thought of it made his chest ache. It was a pain that had no outlet and no clean wound to dress. It was buried deep, pulsing with every breath. When he reached Ian Lewis's office, he didn't hesitate. The door swung open with the force of his arrival, striking the wall behind it. The room was empty. The desk, the blinds, the faint smell of aftershave and paperwork. Everything was still, except for the flicker of light on the CCTV monitor. Fred's eyes locked on it, and his heart lurched. On the screen, Anya sat in her cell, her body curled in on itself, a ghost of exhaustion written in every line of her. Her tray of food sat untouched beside her, the water bottle still full. He leaned closer, his jaw tightening as he watched Ian step into the frame. The man stood a few feet from Anya, speaking to her, his posture measured, his face unreadable. Fred's stomach twisted. He could almost hear the low timbre of Ian's voice, the careful neutrality that masked everything underneath. Anya lifted her head, her eyes blazing with anger that barely covered her hurt. She spoke rapidly, her words sharp, her body trembling, and though he couldn't hear her, Fred could feel the sting of every syllable. It was in her eyes, the same fire that had once made him fall for her, that refusal to be broken, no matter how much the world tried. Fred's hands curled into fists at his sides. His nails dug into his palms until he felt the faint bloom of pain, a small satisfaction in the midst of everything he could not control. When Ian turned to leave the cell, Fred stepped back from the screen. His pulse was quick and violent, his body coiled with restraint he barely held on to. He stood by the door, waiting. The silence was heavy and taut. Moments later, the echo of footsteps approached. The handle turned, and the door opened. Ian entered, his expression shadowed by fatigue, and barely had the chance to draw breath before Fred's voice cut through the space, low and dangerous. "What the hell were you doing in there?" The question hit like a blow. Ian froze, the weight of Fred's fury pressing between them. For a moment, neither spoke, the air dense with everything unsaid. Fred took a step forward, his shoulders squared, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. "I asked you a question," he said again, his voice colder this time. "What the hell were you doing in there with Anya?" Ian's expression shifted, a fleeting shadow of something human crossing his features before it vanished beneath the hard edges of control. He ran a hand across his face, exhaled, then met Fred's eyes. "That's none of your concern." Fred laughed once, softly, but the sound was jagged. "None of my concern," he repeated, each word precise, lethal. "You dragged her in there. You humiliated her. You think any of this is none of my concern?" He stepped closer until there was almost no space between them. "She's the woman I love. Everything that happens to her is my concern." Ian didn't flinch, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. His voice stayed even, though it wavered at the edges. "I was doing my job." Fred's temper flared, hot and bright. "Your job?" His hands twitched at his sides. "Your job is to find the truth, not to bury it because it's easier to follow the wrong lead. You had no evidence, no motive, just Elizabeth's words, and you took them like gospel." His voice dropped, quiet now, far more dangerous. "You didn't even question her, Ian. You didn't give her a chance to breathe before you put her in chains." Ian's gaze hardened. "Step back," he said simply. Fred didn't move. The silence between them felt electric, as if the whole room were holding its breath. His eyes narrowed, his voice falling into a whisper that struck deeper than a shout. "You're a coward," he said, "and you know it." Something flickered in Ian's expression, a crack too brief to name. Fred saw it and turned away, disgust warring with grief. He shook his head, the words falling from his lips like a promise. You can hide behind your badge, but this isn't over. I'll get her out. And when I do, you'll answer for every single thing you've done. He brushed past Ian, the collision of their shoulders hard enough to rattle both men. The door slammed behind him with a sharp, final sound that left the air quivering. Ian stayed where he was, frozen in the wake of Fred's fury. His breath came shallow, his chest tight. He could still feel the echo of Fred's presence and the raw conviction in his voice. You're a coward. The words lingered, not as accusation, but as truth. He ran a hand over his face, his fingers trembling slightly, then turned back toward the monitor. The scene still showed Anya's cell. She sat motionless, her head bowed, her hands limp in her lap. The light caught her hair like a faint halo, though there was nothing angelic about her suffering. She looked like someone hollowed out by too much love and too much loss. Ian's throat tightened. The room around him felt suffocating. He tried to push Fred's words away, but they clung to him, whispering in the back of his mind. He had wanted what Fred had, though he had never dared to say it aloud. Not the badge or the rank. Those were just trappings of a life he had already mastered. What he had wanted was quieter, deeper, and more dangerous. He had wanted what Fred carried effortlessly, the love of a woman who looked at him as though he were her home, a child who reached for him without hesitation, a life that meant more than the uniform, more than the cases and the sleepless nights. But that life had never been his to have. It had always been Fred's. Hope.
Ian Lewis felt the weight of everything he had built begin to tremble beneath him. Fred would never see him as anything but an enemy. Ian sank back into the worn leather of his chair, the edge of the desk pressing cold against his forearms, his stomach twisting with something bitter, sharp, and achingly close to regret. Was it worth it? He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that the one friend he had trusted in this world had walked away, leaving a chasm behind that he wasn't sure he could ever bridge. The weight of his loneliness pressed into his chest like ice, and he sat heavily, one hand running over his face as if to smooth the ache away, as if that might silence the roaring thoughts that filled the silence of his office, louder than any sound he could hear. Fred's rage had been justified. Every accusation and every flash of anger cut deep because it was true. Ian had allowed pride, a rigid adherence to rules, and the blind certainty of protocol to eclipse his judgment. He had acted too quickly, too harshly, and now Anya, who had done nothing to deserve this, was paying the price for it. He drew in a slow, measured breath and reached for his phone, fingers hovering over the keypad. Hesitation clutched him. This won't fix everything. No, it will not. But it might be a start. The line rang twice before a clipped, professional voice answered. This is George Tennyson. Detective Ian Lewis. I need to speak to you about Anya Woodberg's case, Ian said, his voice sharp, precise, a blade of control cutting through the tremor in his chest. There was a pause. Go on. The hearing is set for next week. I want to make something very clear. I expect to see Anya Woodberg granted her freedom, Ian said, jaw tightening, the words almost tasting like iron in his mouth. Tennyson hesitated. Detective, that's not entirely in my control. The evidence? There is no evidence, Ian snapped, patience fraying. There was no proper investigation before her arrest. No DNA, no confession, nothing but a name dragged up by someone with a grudge. That is the only thing linking her to this. Another pause. So you're saying she was arrested unfairly? Ian pinched the bridge of his nose and exhaled sharply. I'm saying that if this case is handled properly in court, there is no reason for her to remain behind bars. Push for her release. Make it clear to the judge that this case is weak at best and a complete failure at worst. Tennyson hummed, a sound that was part amusement, part curiosity. Interesting to hear this coming from the officer who arrested her. Ian clenched his jaw. Just do your job. I'll handle the rest. A small chuckle came through the line. Consider it done, Detective Lewis. The call ended with a soft click, but Ian did not move. The weight in his chest remained, solid and unyielding. Anya would still face the court, but now, at least, there was a chance. He had carved that chance out for her with his own hands. He rose immediately after the call, slipping into his coat, the fabric rough against his shirt, and strode through the corridors of the station. His mind was a river of calculation, flowing fast and jagged. He had to find Fred, tell him about the hearing, and plant the seed of hope that might temper the fire he had seen burning in his friend's eyes. If Fred knew the law was moving in Anya's favor, it might ease the weight pressing him down. He passed officers without meeting their eyes, a shadow moving through the hum of the station, and stopped at the front desk. "Where's Stevenson?" he asked, his voice low, steady. "Left a while ago, sir. Looked pretty pissed," Jenkins answered, shrugging. Ian exhaled, a sharp, controlled release. Of course he was. Of course. He turned on his heel and stepped into the crisp London air, the chill biting at the back of his neck and threading through the collar of his coat, pulling at the tension in his shoulders. The streets were slick with the residue of a morning rain, the faint shimmer of wet stone catching the dull reflection of the pale sun as it strained to pierce the clouds. The scent of damp asphalt and exhaust clung to the air, mingling with the faint aroma of baked bread from a nearby bakery, and Ian inhaled it with a conscious awareness of every detail, letting the rhythm of the city pulse through him, steady and indifferent to the chaos within. He drew his phone from his pocket and dialed Fred's number, listening to the hollow ring echo through the line. Once, twice, 3 times, each ring stretching into a fragile measure of hope that was immediately extinguished by silence. A curse left his lips, low and rough, a sound swallowed by the space between cars and the distant hum of footsteps on the pavement. He slid the phone back into his coat pocket, the leather stiff beneath his fingers, and his gaze swept the street with the precision of someone mapping every corner of a battlefield he had yet to enter. Fred would not answer, and Ian knew the patterns his friend followed when the weight of the world became unbearable, when he sought solitude or attempted to lose himself in a city that offered no comfort. He knew the handful of places Fred might go, the few spaces where grief and fury could exist without intrusion, and Ian's chest tightened at the thought of finding him there, not with confrontation in mind, but with the fragile possibility of reconciliation, or at least of bearing witness to the storm that raged behind those guarded eyes. He slid into his car, the leather seat cold and rigid beneath him, and the click of the key in the ignition felt like a summons. The engine hummed alive beneath him, a deep vibration that traveled through his arms, his chest, and the soles of his shoes, a tactile reminder that the city would keep moving, even as everything he held inside threatened to unravel. He pulled onto the road, gray buildings and pale reflections of sky rushing past in a blurred mosaic, and the city smelled faintly of wet stone and exhaust, but also of faint heat from the morning sun struggling against the clouds, of human persistence in the quiet streets where life continued regardless of private despair. The tires hummed over the wet asphalt, each rotation a steady drumbeat of anticipation, a pulse that mirrored the anxious rhythm in his chest, a drum that reminded him that he was moving towards something unavoidable, that a reckoning awaited. The conversation to come would not be easy. Fred's anger had not softened, had not bent to logic or reason, had not been tempered by the facts Ian had set in motion to secure Anya's freedom. There was no gentle path through this. There was only the drive, the quiet burn of determination behind his eyes, and the knowledge that the weight of truth demanded confrontation. Ian's hands rested lightly on the wheel, feeling the faint tremor of his own urgency, and his mind traced the route Fred would have taken, the small havens he might have sought, each possibility layering the tension with a careful, taut awareness of proximity, of inevitability. Fred had walked away, leaving a silence between them thick and bruising. He needed to know. Ian needed him to know. The city moved past in quiet waves, the rhythm of tires on asphalt, a metronome counting down to what could not be postponed, and Ian leaned slightly into the wheel, shoulders rigid, jaw clenched, heart thudding with the kind of anticipation that was equal parts dread and desire, and he let the road carry him forward, toward the places where the heart of his reckoning waited, untamed, unrelenting, and necessary.